So as I said, in my gut, it kind of feels like this is going to be a bit of a vocab test in relation to these DNS zones concepts. So with that in mind, let's actually go through just the variety of different possible use cases that you may need to think about anytime it comes time to adding new resolution into an existing DNS infrastructure. Here I am back on our machine at dc.company.pri, and on this machine we have DNS services installed. Obviously we do because we have an Active Directory here, so our DNS server is also serving up all the SRV records to support Active Directory. If I launch DNS Manager here, you'll see that I have DNS hooked up both to DC as well as our secondary domain controller, DC2. On that computer DC2, I also have DNS services launched, but haven't done anything outside of just simply getting DNS services on that machine. And so you can see here, if I could just kind of scroll down through the forward and reverse lookup zones on DC and DC2, we can see a couple of the areas in which name resolution has been already configured here on one of these two machines, that being DC1. On DC1, we have company.pri. This is the primary lookup zone that was created in part to support Active Directory. And inside it, we have a variety of subfolders here, subdomains. These subdomains include those SRV records that are the way in which different clients and servers in Active Directory find Active Directory services. A lot of this is stuff that you've already seen when we went through the 70-410 content. So with an eye towards not repeating what you already know, what I really want to talk about here are the variety of different additional things that you might have to think about. Now, one of those very first things is just simply making this DNS zone highly available or more highly available. One way in which we can do that starts by actually creating the zone in some other location. That's why we have this second DNS server down here, DC2. You've probably experienced in the past that whenever you're configuring your clients, you tend to configure them with two different DNS servers, the second being the secondary, which is used when the client can't access that first DNS server. When you're talking about DNS clients, there's that baked-in assumption that any of the DNS servers they're attaching to, as primary or secondary, are going to have equivalent information. Now, one of the first things I want to show you is that back here on our first machine, DC, you can actually create additional DNS zones by simply right-clicking and choosing to create a new zone. Over here, we have our initial zone, which was company.pri, and that's the internal DNS zone for our internal resources. But you may imagine that your company may also have an external zone as well, like a company.com. So it's entirely possible for you to create a new primary zone, and for now I won't store it in Active Directory. We'll get to that just a bit later. When I create that new primary zone, I simply need to give the zone a name, company.com, choose Next here, and then choose whether I want to use an existing zone file, the contents of the zone, or to create a new one on this server. I'll create a new file here that'll be located in system root /system32/DNS. I have another decision here that I have to make in terms of how I want to configure dynamic updates on this zone. Dynamic updates are a really useful way to allow the clients to auto-register their records in DNS without having to go through any manual additional steps. If you were around a generation ago when every new client coming online had to have its own individual DNS record entered into that DNS database, you know how awesome it is to have dynamic updates these days. Now, in an internal zone where you've got a bunch of clients that are connecting up and maybe removing themselves from the database and adding themselves and clients constantly coming online, having some measure of dynamic updates, whether it's non-secure or whether it's secure when you move to Active Directory integration, is something you probably want to do. Without doing so, you'll find yourself spending a lot of time making sure that your DNS names and your client IPs are perfectly matched. But in an external zone, this company.com zone that we're intending to create here, it's probably less important that we have dynamic updates and more important that we have more security. And so anytime you're dealing with any of these zones that are perhaps more stable, that maybe are externally facing, it's probably a better idea for you to configure not to allow dynamic updates on the zone as opposed to allow. Now, once you configure this new zone here, that actually creates the company.com zone. And we'll, in the next module, talk more about the creation of records in this zone that we've created. The main thing I want you to recognize here is that this zone is now resolvable for anything at company.com. And later on, again, when we get to that next module, we'll talk more about getting the records in and the types of records you could add and why you would add them. But more so than that, what I want to talk also about is, in addition to creating primary zones, we also sometimes have the need to create secondary zones as well. I mentioned just a second ago that generally when you're configuring any kind of clients, you usually configure a primary and secondary DNS server. And the idea is that that client only goes to the secondary server when the primary is offline. Clients really want the content of both your primary and secondary server to be the same. So we have to have some way of replicating the content that exists in company.pri down here onto our other server, DC2. Now, in order to do that, if we created a new zone here, obviously we wouldn't want to create a new primary zone because that would be essentially an empty location with no content, as we saw with company.com. Rather, when we're attempting to create this high availability situation with a couple of different servers, one way in which we do that is by creating a secondary zone. These secondary zones, as you can see, cannot be stored in Active Directory. And secondary zones are essentially a way to create a non-writable copy of an existing DNS zone. So let's call this secondary zone company.pri because that's exactly the DNS namespace that we want to replicate. And in fact, if I go here under Next, I need to type in the IP address of the server that contains the primary zone. 192.168.0.100 is our server dc.company.pri. So if I choose Next here and then Finish, you'll see that we now have a secondary zone here called company.pri that here in a second or so will end up loading all the content from my company.pri zone over here on DC. Now the same holds true not only for the forward lookup zones, but also these reverse lookup zones like you see here. Reverse lookup zones are written in kind of strange backwards notation in that it is the first octets, first 1, 2, or 3 octets in that IP address written in reverse order followed by in-addr.arpa. So this reverse lookup zone has been configured to contain all the records that correspond to 192.168.0. everything else. Reverse lookup zones can be created with only 3 different types of subnet masks, essentially a /8, /16, or /24 subnet mask, which effectively means that you create a reverse zone based off of which of the 4 different octets you're interested in capturing in that zone. I'm interested in the 254 records that exist sub to the 0 subnet here, so that's why I've created this zone in this way. Now I could create another, just as before, I could create another reverse primary zone here, but instead what I'm looking for is to create high availability on this second server. So instead, what I'm interested in here is to create another secondary zone that happens to be a reverse lookup zone that corresponds to what I see over on dc.company.pri. This will be an IPv4 reverse lookup zone, with the network ID being 192.168.0. I could do a shorter one if I wanted to, but I couldn't do anything greater than a 24-bit subnet mask. You can only configure it by octet, or essentially what number is on either side of the period. Once I do that and choose Next here, I'll need to identify just which master server contains the zone, which again is 192.168.0.100. And if I choose Next again and Finish, you'll see here that we now have a reverse lookup zone that corresponds to what we saw back up here on DC.